Imagine gaining independence, changing your flag, creating your own government, and becoming a sovereign nation, yet decades later, continuing to use a currency whose history leads directly back to your former colonial ruler. This is the story of the CFA franc. Today, 14 sub-Saharan African countries use CFA franc currencies across 2 monetary unions. 8 are in West Africa, and 6 are in Central Africa. France diplomacy +1. The countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo in West Africa, and Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon in Central Africa. BCAEO. But here's where the story becomes controversial. The CFA franc was created during the colonial era, and when it was introduced in 1945, its original name literally referred to the French colonies of Africa. BCAEO +1. So how did a monetary system created during French colonial rule survive after these countries became independent? And why does France still have a role in the system today?
To understand the controversy, we have to go back to the beginning. In December 1945, France created the CFA franc as part of the monetary system governing its African colonies. The currency was tied closely to the French monetary system. Over time, however, its name changed. The West African version eventually became associated with the African Financial Community, while the Central African version became the Financial Cooperation in Central Africa, BCEAO. The countries themselves also changed. One after another, they became independent states. But the monetary framework did not simply disappear. Instead, it evolved. And that evolution created a system that still exists today.
Today, the system is very different from what existed during colonial rule. The West African and Central African CFA currencies are issued by African central banks, not by the French government. France also no longer sits on the governing bodies of the West African Monetary Union in the way it once did. But France still has a formal monetary relationship with these systems. And that relationship includes something extremely important. France guarantees the convertibility of the CFA currencies. The currencies also maintain fixed exchange rate arrangements with the euro. France diplomacy +1. Supporters say this provides monetary stability and helps protect the currencies from extreme fluctuations. Critics see something very different. They argue that a currency system linked to France and the euro can restrict the monetary freedom of African states. And that is where the debate begins.
But the CFA franc is only one piece of the puzzle. For decades, France's relationship with its former African colonies extended far beyond currency. It involved business, military cooperation, diplomatic relationships, political connections, and a network of influence that became known by a controversial name, Françafrique. And to understand why this relationship became so powerful, we have to go back to the moment African countries began gaining independence. Because independence did not necessarily mean France was ready to completely walk away.
When African countries began becoming independent, the relationship with France did not simply disappear. The flags changed. New governments took power. Colonial administrations were replaced by national institutions. But behind the scenes, France worked to preserve close relationships with many of its former colonies. This was not necessarily a single secret plan controlled from one office. It was a network of agreements, personal relationships, economic interests, military cooperation, and diplomatic ties that developed over time. The French approach became associated with a term that would later become famous, Françafrique.
The word described the unusually close and often controversial relationship between France and parts of Africa. For France, there were strategic reasons to maintain these relationships. Africa offered important economic opportunities. French companies could continue doing business in markets where they already had established connections. France also wanted to maintain its international influence. And during the Cold War, Africa became part of a much larger global competition. The United States and Soviet Union were competing for influence around the world. European powers were also trying to protect their strategic interests. So newly independent African states suddenly found themselves at the center of international competition. And France was determined not to completely lose its position. One of the most important parts of this relationship was security. France maintained defense agreements with several African countries. French troops could be stationed in certain countries. And in some situations, France intervened militarily. These interventions sometimes involved evacuating foreign citizens, supporting governments, or responding to armed conflicts. The military relationship gave France something that many former colonial powers no longer possessed: a continuing ability to project power directly into parts of Africa. But it also created controversy. Critics questioned whether French intervention was really about protecting African stability, or whether Paris was protecting its own strategic interests. And the relationship wasn't limited to military power. Politics played an important role too. French presidents maintained relationships with African leaders, sometimes for decades. Presidential meetings, diplomatic visits, private negotiations, and personal connections created a political network that was difficult to see from the outside. This is one reason the history of Françafrique remains so controversial. It wasn't simply about treaties between governments. It was also about relationships between powerful individuals. And when those relationships became unusually close, questions about transparency and influence inevitably followed. But there was another pillar holding this relationship together: money. French businesses became deeply involved in several African economies: banking, energy, telecommunications, construction, transport, and natural resources all created commercial connections between France and African markets. For decades, this created a relationship where political influence and economic interests could reinforce one another. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than the CFA franc. Because if currency is the financial foundation, then business and political relationships formed another layer of influence. For decades, this system remained remarkably resilient. But Africa was changing. A younger generation began questioning old relationships. New global powers entered African markets. And public frustration with France grew in several countries. The old model of French influence was beginning to face a serious challenge. Money is one of the most powerful tools a country can control. It determines how prices move, how businesses plan, how imports are paid for, and how governments respond when an economy enters a crisis. That is why the CFA franc has generated such a fierce debate. Supporters point to one major advantage: stability. The CFA franc is fixed to the euro at a set exchange rate. That means businesses operating within the monetary unions don't have to deal with the same level of exchange rate uncertainty that countries with freely floating currencies may experience. For companies importing goods, planning investments, or trading across borders, that predictability can be valuable. The system also creates something larger than a currency. It creates monetary unions. In West Africa, 8 countries share the West African CFA franc through the West African Economic and Monetary Community. In Central Africa,
6 countries share the Central African CFA franc through the Central African Economic and Monetary Community. The two currencies have the same CFA abbreviation, but they are technically separate currencies. Together, they form a monetary system covering 14 countries. IMF e-Library +1. For supporters, this regional integration is an advantage. Instead of 14 completely separate monetary systems, countries can coordinate monetary policy and facilitate financial transactions within their respective unions.
But stability comes with a trade-off. When a country has its own floating currency, its central bank can allow that currency to fall in value when economic conditions demand it. That can make its exports cheaper internationally. It can also make imported goods more expensive. But under a fixed exchange rate system, that option is much more limited. The exchange rate is maintained against the euro, so governments and central banks have less freedom to use currency depreciation as a tool for responding to economic shocks. And this is one of the strongest arguments made by critics of the CFA system. They ask, can a currency designed around stability also give countries enough flexibility to pursue their own economic priorities? There is no simple answer.
History has already shown what can happen when the system faces severe pressure. In 1994, the CFA franc was sharply devalued. Its value against the French franc was cut in half. The decision was made to address serious economic imbalances and restore competitiveness. IMF e-Library +1. For ordinary people, a currency devaluation can have consequences far beyond financial markets. Imported goods can become more expensive. Savings can lose purchasing power. Businesses may struggle with higher costs. But exports can also become more competitive. The episode demonstrated something important. Even a system built around monetary stability isn't completely immune to major economic shocks. Then came another major transformation. When the euro replaced the French franc in 1999, the CFA franc's fixed relationship shifted from the French franc to the euro. The basic arrangement continued. France remained the guarantor of convertibility, and the CFA currencies remained linked to the euro, IMF. But the debate didn't disappear. Instead, it became a question of sovereignty. Critics argued that African countries should have greater control over their monetary systems. Supporters argued that the arrangement provides credibility and protects against extreme monetary instability. Economists have also pointed to both sides. Research has identified benefits such as relatively strong price stability, while also highlighting challenges involving competitiveness and the ability to respond to economic shocks. IMF +1. So the question isn't simply, is the CFA franc good or bad? The real question is, who should have the final authority over African money? And the system has already begun changing. In 2019, West African leaders announced reforms to the CFA framework. The reforms were intended to modernize the monetary relationship with France. Among the changes, France's role in the governance of the West African monetary system was reduced. But the fixed exchange rate with the euro remained, and France continued to guarantee unlimited convertibility. That tells us something important. The relationship wasn't simply frozen in the colonial era. It has changed, it has been renegotiated, and it continues to evolve. But money is only one way influence can survive. There is another question that may be even more important. What happens when the currency relationship is combined with French companies, military agreements, political connections, and access to strategic resources? Because when all these pieces are placed on the same map, a much larger picture begins to appear. And that is where the story of Françafrique becomes truly controversial. For decades, France had something many other foreign powers could only dream of: a deep network of relationships across parts of Africa.
But by the 2010s, and especially the early 2020s, that influence began to weaken. The change wasn't caused by one event. It came from several pressures building at the same time. A new generation of Africans was questioning relationships inherited from the colonial era. Social media gave ordinary people a much louder voice, and governments increasingly looked beyond France for economic and military partnerships. The old relationship was entering unfamiliar territory.
Security became one of the biggest turning points. France had deployed troops across parts of the Sahel to fight jihadist groups and support regional governments. But after years of military operations, the security situation remained difficult. Attacks continued, armed groups remained active, and public frustration grew in several countries. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, military governments eventually took power through coups. Their relationships with France deteriorated rapidly. French troops were pushed out, diplomatic tensions increased, and the era of automatic French military cooperation began to look very different.
But something else was happening at the same time. Other powers were moving closer. Russia expanded its diplomatic and security engagement in parts of Africa. China strengthened its economic presence through infrastructure, trade, and investment. Turkey, the Gulf states, India, and others also increased their relationships with African countries. For African governments, this created more choices. Instead of relying heavily on one traditional partner, they could negotiate with several. And that changes the balance of power.
France also faced another challenge: its image. For some Africans, France remained an important partner with valuable investment, education, and diplomatic connections. For others, French influence represented an unfinished chapter of colonialism. That disagreement became increasingly visible. Protests sometimes featured French flags being rejected, while alternative foreign flags appeared in their place. But public opinion across Africa is far from uniform. Millions of people still have cultural, educational, and economic connections with France. French remains widely spoken across many countries. Students study in French institutions. Businesses continue trading with French companies. And families on both sides of the Mediterranean remain connected. So the story isn't simply Africa versus France. It's much more complicated.
And this is where the word control needs to be examined carefully. France does not govern 14 independent African countries. Those countries have their own presidents, parliaments, central banks, courts, and national institutions. They can make decisions that France strongly opposes, and several have demonstrated exactly that in recent years. So calling the CFA system proof that France secretly controls 14 countries would oversimplify reality. The more accurate question is different. How much influence can survive after political control has ended? That is the question that makes this story so fascinating. Because influence doesn't always require direct authority. It can operate through trade, investment, military cooperation, diplomacy, culture, and financial institutions.
And today, that influence is being renegotiated. Some African countries want stronger economic sovereignty. Others value the stability and international connections provided by existing arrangements. France itself has acknowledged that its relationship with Africa must change. The old model, built over generations, can no longer simply continue unchanged. Africa has become more connected to the rest of the world, and African governments have more alternatives than they did decades ago. The balance is shifting.
So, is France secretly controlling 14 African countries? The evidence doesn't support that simple claim. But the story behind the claim is much more interesting. A colonial currency survived independence. Economic and political relationships continued. Military cooperation created further connections. And for decades, France maintained extraordinary influence across parts of the continent. Now, that influence is being challenged. For more than 7 decades, the relationship between France and parts of Africa has survived independence, economic crises, political upheavals, and changing generations. But today, something fundamental is different. African countries have more choices. The global economy has become more competitive. And the question is no longer whether Africa needs France. The question is whether France can remain an important partner without the extraordinary level of influence it once enjoyed. That distinction could define the next chapter of France-Africa relations.
The CFA franc itself may eventually face another transformation. West African countries have spent years discussing the creation of the ECO, a proposed common currency for the economic community of West African states. The idea is ambitious, a regional currency designed and managed within a broader African framework. But creating a new currency isn't as simple as printing new banknotes. Countries must coordinate inflation, public finances, foreign reserves, interest rates, and economic policies. They must also agree on who controls the system and how countries with very different economies can share one currency. That makes monetary independence a much more complicated project than simply replacing one banknote with another.
And there is another possibility. The existing monetary arrangements could continue, but gradually become more African-led. That would mean reform rather than complete separation. In other words, the future doesn't necessarily have to be France versus Africa. It could become a relationship between partners with different interests, different priorities, and a more equal balance of influence. That may ultimately be the biggest change. Not the disappearance of France, but the disappearance of the assumption that France must remain at the center.
There is also a lesson here that goes far beyond France. Colonialism can end politically, while parts of the systems created during that period can continue evolving long afterward. Currencies, languages, trade networks, legal traditions, military agreements, and business relationships can survive political independence. But survival does not automatically mean control, and influence does not automatically mean ownership. Understanding that difference is essential if we want to understand modern Africa accurately. So, does France secretly control 14 African countries? No. The 14 countries using CFA franc currencies are sovereign states. But the reason this claim continues to attract attention is because the history behind it is real. France created the original CFA franc during the colonial era. The monetary relationship survived independence. France remained involved in the monetary arrangements. And for decades, France maintained deep political, economic, and military relationships across parts of Africa. At the same time, those relationships have changed dramatically, and they are still changing. Perhaps the most important question isn't, does France control Africa? That's too simple. The better question is, how much influence should a former colonial power have over the future of its former colonies? And that question cannot be answered by France alone. It belongs to the African countries themselves, their governments, their businesses, their citizens, and especially the generations that did not experience colonialism directly, but are now deciding what Africa's relationship with the rest of the world should become. The next chapter of this story will not be written in Paris. It will be written in African capitals.
The CFA franc began as a colonial currency. Decades later, it has become part of a much more complicated monetary and political system.
Whether that system represents stability, dependence, cooperation, or some combination of all three, remains a subject of intense debate. But one thing is clear: Africa is changing. Its economies are becoming more connected to the world. Its partnerships are becoming more diverse. And its people are demanding greater control over the decisions that shape their future. The era when one foreign power could dominate the conversation is becoming harder to imagine. The future may belong to a more competitive, more independent, and more multipolar Africa.
If this documentary gave you a different perspective on the relationship between France and Africa, subscribe to Beyond Maps. We explore the hidden systems, forgotten history, unusual places, and powerful forces that shape the world around us. And if you want us to investigate another story that most people don't fully understand, leave it in the comments. Thank you for watching Beyond Maps.